with the big EU referendum only about a week ago, I thought it'd be quite cool to have a look at what would happen if the UK did decide to leave. So the main treaty article we're going to be looking at is Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. And once the UK invokes this, they basically have 2 years and then their membership of the European Union comes to an end. Now, there's two potential outcomes at the end of this 2 years. There would either be withdrawal with an agreement with the EU or a withdrawal without agreement. Now, the UK would probably want to go for some sort of agreement because obviously the EU is a big major trading partner with the UK, and so it's important that there would be some sort of deal in place. Now, the actual procedure under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union would begin with negotiations between the UK and the European Council, the European Council being the heads of state from other EU member states. Once they come to an agreement, there would have to be consent by the European Parliament, and then the agreement would finally be concluded again by the European Council with a super qualified majority. So this would be 72% of the remaining member states, so 20 out of the 27, and it would also have to represent 65% of the EU population. Now, Adam Wojcicki has suggested that there would possibly be 3 treaties required for the UK to withdraw. Firstly, there would have to be an international treaty between the UK and the EU as a whole, which would regulate the withdrawal. Then, EU primary legislation, the treaties, would have to be amended to remove all of the references to the UK. And then finally, there would also potentially have to be an accession treaty for the UK to join one of the other types of European organisations. Now, there's a few options for the UK here, so let's have a look at those. First is the European Free Trade Agreement, or EFTA. Now, there's some advantages and disadvantages to this that I've put on this side. First major advantage, a lower contribution by the UK to Europe. Also, the UK would have freedom to set its own rate of value added tax. It could independently agree trade deals with non-EU states. So at the moment, the UK is hampered by the EU in terms of the trade deals that it negotiates, but it would have a lot more freedom as part of EFTA to agree deals with, say, the United States or China, India, some of those other major economies on the UK's terms. There would also be better protection of UK sovereignty as well. They wouldn't be subject to as many of the EU regulations that they currently are subject to. Now, there are some disadvantages as well. So no access to CAP, which is the Common Agricultural Policy. So this would be a major disadvantage for farmers in the UK who are very reliant on CAP at the moment. Also, even though the UK would be part of the single market, it would have no influence over how the single market is administered. So the UK would lose its seat at the table, so to speak. Also, the UK is much bigger than other EFTA countries. So we're talking about countries like Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein. These are quite small countries or small economies compared to the UK. And this could also lead to a difficult application process because the other countries who are involved in EFTA might veto the UK membership because it could be seen as having a negative effect on their economy. So one of the other options moving on from EFTA is the European Economic Area. Now, this is kind of, the EFTA is the basis for this, and then the European Economic Area is kind of an add-on to EFTA. Again, there are advantages and disadvantages, so it does cover a wider range of areas compared to EFTA, including research, which is important for UK universities, education, employment, so the protection of workers' rights. But this wide range of policy areas could also be seen as a disadvantage as well. So it would also mean free movement of workers would apply to the UK, which, when you consider that the campaign has been run on immigration grounds, would probably not be popular within the UK, and probably one of the reasons why the UK would not become a part of the European Economic Area. Also would include competition law as well, but it doesn't cover other areas, and again this is an advantage and a disadvantage. So it doesn't cover customs union, monetary union, so the UK would have much greater financial freedom, but it also doesn't cover common agricultural policy again, so again that negative effect on farmers, as well as justice policy as well. Again, it would be a smaller financial contribution for the UK compared with how much it pays to the EU at the time being. But the problem is that most EU regulations would continue to exist. And again, the Brexit campaign is mainly sort of saying that the EU shouldn't have control over the regulations that apply under UK law. And again, the UK would only have indirect influence over EU law, so it would be able to sit on committees, but it wouldn't be able to have a vote. So I think the most likely outcome or the most likely withdrawal agreement would be based on the Swiss model, and I've called this EFTA plus. So we've already talked about the advantages and disadvantages of EFTA as a basis for an agreement with the EU. But what Switzerland have done is they've also concluded other treaties with the EU on a range of areas where it's helped them. And this has been particularly advantageous to the Swiss in a range of policy areas. So they've got the grounding in EFTA, and then they've moved beyond this and sought other agreements as well. Now, because the UK is a much bigger economy than the Swiss economy, arguably the UK would be in a strong negotiating position and might be able to get a really good deal. However, it would also include acceptance of EU economic regulation, which would probably be unpopular here in the United Kingdom. There are also questions about whether the EU would agree to this. There's been a lot of criticism within the European Union about the current agreement that they have with Switzerland. They think that Switzerland gets a lot out of the deal and the EU doesn't get very much in return. And so it seems unlikely that the EU would potentially agree to a similar model for the UK, especially given the negotiating powers. So it'd be interesting to see how, within that 2 year period after Article 50 is invoked, which way the agreements would go down. So what other effects would there be on the UK leaving the EU? Well, in terms of the effects on rights, there's a couple of key arguments here. There's the argument that the rights that we have under the EU, such as those under Article 20, citizenship, Article 45, free movement of workers, should be retained. Authority for this comes from a couple of key sources. The Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties 1969 suggests that once a right is executed, it can't be withdrawn. And also the famous case of Van Gendenloos, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which suggests that an individual's legal heritage outlasts the instrument that created it. Now, this is all well saying that, but EU law itself doesn't have a saving provision, and there's an argument that if the citizens of the UK did retain their rights under EU law, this could potentially create ridiculous situations. So, for example, under Article 20, the right to citizenship also includes the right to vote in European Parliament elections, but if the UK didn't have any seats or in the European Parliament, that would just be a stupid situation. So I think that the most likely outcome is that this would be part of the withdrawal agreement. So the UK and the EU, during that 2 year period, would have to come to some sort of agreement about what rights should be retained and which rights should be lost. So, for example, on free movement of persons, while this is most likely to stop after the 2 year period, it may be that anyone who is in the UK at that time wouldn't automatically become an illegal immigrant. And in a similar fashion, people from the UK who are currently living on the continent would also not become illegal immigrants automatically after 2 years. Again, that would be a sort of ridiculous situation to occur and a sensible point of agreement potentially. And what about the effect on law as well? Well, regulations would automatically stop being a part of UK law. They're directly applicable at the moment, which means that the UK doesn't have to do anything to implement them. This means that if the UK left, regulations would simply stop applying. Directives, on the other hand, are incorporated into UK law, and so the implementing legislation, which is often done through statutory instruments, regulations, orders at a UK level, these would have to be revoked. Now, in theory, the European Communities Act could be repealed by the UK Parliament, and this would stop EU law immediately. But it's unlikely that the UK would do this. Section 2.2, which I've mentioned there, gives the right to ministers to make regulations and orders based on EU directives and allows certain parts of EU law into the UK legal system. Now, obviously, a lot of EU law has become ingrained within our society, and simply losing those rights would be a major disadvantage. So it's unlikely that the European Communities Act 1972 would simply be repealed itself. It's more likely that certain regulations or orders in the UK law that were from the EU and the UK did not like would be individually revoked, and the European Communities Act would probably remain in place, at least Section 2.2 would, so that those implemented directives would continue to have effect. There is also another potentially interesting effect on the law, and this comes from the Sewell Convention. The Sewell Convention basically says that when the UK government passes a law which would have an impact on the devolved legislatures, so we're talking here about the Welsh Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, and the Northern Ireland Assembly, then those devolved legislatures should give their consent. All three devolution acts would also need to be amended. Now, there's a question about whether Scotland would give its consent in such a situation. At the moment, the polls seem to suggest that the Scottish are very pro-European and that the Scottish people would vote to remain. Now, the SNP, the Scottish National Party in the UK Parliament, argued that there should be a double majority, so the UK should only leave if not only there was a majority in the UK referendum, but also a majority in England, in Wales, in Scotland, and in Northern Ireland as well. This was voted down, and so we're going on a simple UK majority come June the 23rd. However, if the Scottish are determined to remain in the EU, this does raise really interesting questions about whether Nicola Sturgeon, leader of the SNP, would push for a Scottish independence referendum. This is obviously only after a couple of years since the first Scottish independence referendum, but there is the argument that such a dramatic change in circumstances would spur the Scottish people to demand a second independence referendum so that they could remain part of the EU. So really interesting times here in the UK at the moment. I think in terms of the law, the Remain campaign probably have the easier argument because things would just stay the same. For Brexiteers, it's a bit more difficult because the actual mechanics of a withdrawal agreement are hard to predict. Would the UK join EFTA? Would it want to join EFTA? That's a whole other argument. Also remember, Article 50 has never been invoked before, so this would be not only new territory for the UK, but also for the EU as a whole. And it's hard to say whether a succinct or full agreement could be reached by the 2-year deadline. Anyway, I'm probably not going to do another video for another week or so because I'm exercising my right to free movement and I'm going to watch England versus Wales in Lens. But hopefully I'll be back with another video next week. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to do the whole like, comment, subscribe thing, and I'll see you soon. Bye!